And what's interesting now is this question of vision. People are yearning for it, and I think that we've all talked about this in terms of leadership, is that the great leaders that you kind of infer, are able to paint a picture of the future so vivid, seemingly so real, that they can almost guide people to step within it and say, and let me ask you, what will that country look like? And how will you feel on that day, which is really the key. And that's the notion of leadership as to vision that Kennedy clearly was brilliant at. I mean, no one disputes that. Obviously, he wasn't alive to have the outcomes visible to him, but I think that's the echo of Kennedy now. Who can speak to vision in that way?
The subject of tonight's discussion, JFK, A Vision for America, commemorates what would have been President Kennedy's 100th birthday by collecting his most important speeches and combining them with photos from his life and essays by historians, politicians, political thinkers, authors, and artists on his legacy. We look forward to the conversation tonight. Please join me now in welcoming this evening's distinguished panelists.
Well, good evening. It's absolute pleasure to be with you this evening, to have an opportunity to moderate this panel and to discuss what I think is an absolutely marvelous book, a new book that Stephen Kennedy Smith and Douglas Brinkley have put together, which we're going to speak about this evening on this, the 100th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's birth. I don't know if you've been over to 83 Beals Street across the river in Brookline, but it's remarkable to think about the fact that our 35th president was born in that house. If you visit it today, I think it feels a little bit cramped, actually, to a modern visitor. There are narrow hallways and small rooms. But in 1914, when Joseph Kennedy bought the house for $6,500, $2,000 down and $4,500 in a mortgage, I think, and he and his wife Rose wanted to raise a large family. It suited their purposes very well. It was just the sort of neighborhood they wanted to be in. And of course, it's worth mentioning on Mother's Day, it did become a large family with 9 children. And second in that lineup was, of course, John Fitzgerald, second in order after Joseph Jr. And Jack would grow up to become the 35th President of the United States. And what we want to do over the next hour or so is talk about John F. Kennedy. Some of you, I think, are aware, maybe most of you, that the Harvard Archives just this last week made available to us an extraordinary new tape, which was made in 1937. If you haven't heard it yet, I draw it to your attention. It's not that long. It is sophomore Jack Kennedy in a class giving a speech on Hugo Black, who has been appointed to the Supreme Court. And you see, I think, the politician-to-be at age 19 or 20. It's quite remarkable. But I mention it here because, of course, this place, Harvard and Harvard Square, is important in the story that we're going to discuss in a lot of different ways. And it's of special interest, perhaps, to me to have this discussion because I am at work myself on a biography of John F. Kennedy, and so it's a special pleasure for me to be here. I think what we should do is we should begin a conversation, and I wonder if I can maybe call on you, Stephen, first to tell us a little bit about the conception of the book. One of the things that I find striking, Stephen, in your very moving introduction to the book is that you remind us of something important, which is that for John F. Kennedy, politics matters and government matters. And I think he believes that government has to be a force, can be and must be a force for good in society. And at one point you say that the idea of effective national government is under constant attack. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, Stephen. It seems to me that's an important takeaway for you in putting this project together.
So thank you, Fred. I will do that, but before I do that, I'm going to do something that people from political families do, which is not answer the question. So first of all, what about our panel? We have 3 Pulitzer Prize winners and an RFK Book Award winner. The best and the brightest are still showing up for JFK. Can we have a hand for our panel, please? The other thing that I wanted to say briefly is that, so President Kennedy launched his political career not far from here in the Sheraton Commander Hotel in 1946. My grandfather had a tea party there for him, and it was very well attended because I think he paid a lot of the people to come to it. But he also gave one of his great speeches, which is in the book, in 1956, just a block from here in Harvard Yard, the commencement address, and then, of course, his famous City on the Hill speech at the State House. And so it's really great to be here with you all. I did also want to read something, Fred, before I respond to your question, from this book that was given to me by my uncle, the late great senator from Massachusetts, Senator Kennedy, and this is something he put together for the family, and it's both quotations and stories. But this is him talking about the West Virginia primary. During the hard-fought and crucial West Virginia primary, I just finished giving a rousing speech in which I said to the audience, "Do you want a man who will give the country leadership? Do you want a man who has vigor and vision?" In the middle of my talk, Jack took the microphone from me and said, "I would like to tell my brother that you cannot be elected president until you are 35 years of age." I just really like that, and I wanted to remember my Uncle Ted. So to respond to your question, I do think that there has been a loss of confidence in major American institutions since President Kennedy was killed, and in particular Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, 2 of our other great leaders. And what our task is as a nation is to remember the things that we have in common, our shared civic bonds and our common humanity, and that's what I think President Kennedy spoke to. And of course, he was a member of the press himself. He respected the press. He gave one of the great speeches against religious discrimination. He saw the United States as an effective and pragmatic actor in international institutions, which I hope Samantha will talk about. And I think he had a vision of America not only as a powerful military nation, but as a great civilization, great morally, great artistically, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, great physically, the President Physical Fitness Challenge, great spiritually, his speech against religious discrimination, and great, the Civil Rights Act. And so his vision of America was America as a great civilization, not as a nationalist nation that just focuses on military spending. And so I hope that we can, restore that vision of America to our current political discourse.
How do the rest of you, it seems to me, maybe I'll ask this of you, Doug, since you're a fellow historian. What Stephen has described, Doug, to at least some extent we've lost. I don't know, can you speak a little bit to why that is? Why have we gone away from that vision of America that John F. Kennedy articulated?
We've drifted away from, look at the speeches of John F. Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt. We were a nation that could be moved by beautiful oratory that was filled with a sense of optimism and pointing our fingers towards the future where great things can be done, the whole optimistic can-do spirit of the American way. It transcended that kind of language and attitude it had to what our basement-like politics are today. Everybody now are in a kind of a war with, it's like pit bull wars between Democrats and Republicans, nobody speaking of unity. Part of it is John F. Kennedy's generation served in the Second World War. Whether you're George Herbert Walker Bush or John F. Kennedy, you had these sort of moments being in uniform and working together with people from different parts of the country. If you read The great novel by Norman Mailer, Naked and the Dead. It's all about a Jewish kid from Brooklyn who has to go to the Pacific, and he's with a group of Texans, and how they have to learn how to interact with each other and become a band of brothers, so to speak. But we don't have that kind of shared sense of civic duty anymore that Kennedy was so keen on when he first 100 days. John F. Kennedy created the Peace Corps, and he started within the Alliance for Progress. And then just shortly after his first 100 days, he went to Congress for a joint session and said, we're going to put a man to the moon by the end of the decade, and galvanized our resources and funding to actually do that, to blow the budget of NASA up, to create a manned space center down in Houston, to upgrade Cape Canaveral, to start this amazing process we had of going to the moon. And we accomplished it at the end of John F. Kennedy's life, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins splashed down after Apollo 11, and mission accomplished in a true sense. All of the boards at all of our space centers just flashed up John F. Kennedy's words. And so Kennedy is seen as somebody who put a big, bold effort in front of us, and then we achieved it. And out of the space race, or going to the moon, we've got things like GPS, all sorts of medical pacemakers, new types of piping, and the list goes on and on. Even in Logan Airport here in Boston, you wander around, you'll see their walls are filled with talking about a major scientific inventions that came through that Apollo program that cost so many billions of dollars. I also think it was the power of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal was still there for John F. Kennedy. No, he was not a New Deal liberal. He wasn't an Adlai Stevenson liberal. He didn't even think of, Lyndon Johnson used to say, FDR's my daddy. Kennedy didn't say anything like that. They had sometimes mixed views of FDR, but the progressivism of FDR, that the government's going to make your lives better, we can find things to do. Kennedy creates the Naval SEALs, the Green Beret, and there's a kind of belief in service to country, a new kind of patriotism from a new generation. And I think the New Frontier is one of the most significant moments in U.S. history, because he got eclipsed due to his assassination in Dallas, and the Great Society was so large. We forget that a lot of what Johnson passes had its incubation stages and was starting to grow to maturity in the Kennedy years. I'm writing on the environment, and I'm telling you, the whole 60s environmental movement begins with John F. Kennedy. He hired Stuart Udall to be Interior Secretary. John F. Kennedy saved Cape Cod National Seashore. He saved Padre Island, Texas, the largest protected barrier island in the world. He saved Point Reyes from development, or Marin County in California would have been a much more commercialized place today. He pushed forward a wilderness bill over and over again, meaning large swaths of land that no roads were allowed, that would stay in a pristine wilderness condition. He fought for air pollution controls, clean air and water. All these things were happening. Some got passed, and then he was killed, and Lyndon Johnson continued that march, and it really gives us the 60s environmental movement. In my essay for the book, I honed in on Rachel Carson, who John F. Kennedy loved and adored. She worked for the New Frontier. She worked for the Democratic Advisory Council for the Kennedy campaign in '60. She was writing white papers on the environment. Her concern was telling moms here on Mother's Day, your backyard could be poisoned with toxins or pesticides. That in conservation isn't just about saving, Bear's Ear in Utah or the Yosemite or Mount Rainier. Conservation was about making sure your backyard had no poisons in it, that your kids weren't going to get sick, that your local river could be swum in. If you caught a fish in the Potomac or the Missouri, you could eat that fish, that the Great Lakes weren't toxic. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, comes out in 1962, and the blowback to it was tremendous. American Cyanide and Dow and these companies were saying she's a crackpot spinster. And John F. Kennedy backed her action. He then hired a special commission to look into her book and her findings, and they concluded that Rachel Carson was right. And by endorsing Rachel Carson's, John F. Kennedy began the kind of impassioned broadening of the environmental movement to be one of ecology and nature, and the beginning of thinking about what is sustainable living. And these are just one little element, because we think of the Kennedy presidency, we do the Berlin Wall crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the nuclear test ban treaties, and we kind of study those hot moments. But intellectually, he was starting a wave on space exploration and caring deeply about science and about doing investigation of our oceans and starting to save our natural resources from hyper-industrialization.
Samantha, I want to ask you a question about foreign policy, but before I do, on this theme, you were with the Obama administration for its duration. There was a sense, it seems to me, in 2008, on election night and then thereafter, that perhaps Barack Obama could be a similar kind of figure, in a sense, could speak to some of the things that Doug and Stephen have now spoken about. Is that a fair comment? There was that moment for Obama, would you say?
For some of us, it lasted longer than a moment. In order to justify all that time away from our families, we had to hang on to the dream. First of all, happy Mother's Day, mothers and grandmothers among you. Yeah, I think that, as Stephen noted earlier, the most Kennedy-esque speech, according to that definition of shared values and common experience and common aspirations, was the speech in which Barack Obama broke through to our nation around John Kerry's nomination for the Democratic, to be the Democratic candidate in 2004. And that message was this idea that we could find our common destiny, that we had much more in common than we did apart. I think Barack Obama would be the first to say that in a balkanized media environment where World War II is a much more distant memory than it was 15 years before John Kennedy took office, I think we it's fair to say overestimated the possibility of breaking through and of, what critics on the right would say is that we overestimated our mandate and pushed a more progressive agenda than the full country was ready for. But I think my own view is that in a world of alternative facts or alternative truths, and where at least 40% of the country is getting their news from a wholly different galaxy of facts, it is extremely difficult to build that common constituency. And so I share Stephen's aspiration and of course the programmatic ambition that Doug has spoken to, but we somehow have to find a way for us to be operating, a little bit off the same factual predicate. I think another defining, maybe this we can preview, I'm not sure exactly what you were going to ask about foreign policy, but the way that, in addition to it being only 15 years after World War II, a period of such communal sacrifice, not only one sector of our society being sent off to fight, but our whole society getting activated to participate in winning that conflict, and the sort of the way the imagination of our broad swaths of our society was triggered. You had that, then you had communism. And I think Kennedy was able to use that as a way of forging, again, that sense of a common enemy and thus a common set of sacrifices that we had to put forward. As Stephen was talking, I was reminded of a quote that I had read in this wonderful book that these two guys have put together. And it's when Kennedy accepted the nomination in 1960, and he's laying out his plan for the new frontier. And we all know the ask not line from Kennedy, but this gives it so much more texture. His new frontier, as he put it, sums up not what I intended to offer the American people, but what I intend to ask of them. It appeals to their pride, not their pocketbook. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. And then we must prove over again whether this nation can compete with the single-minded advance of the communist system. Now, I'm not a historian of Kennedy, but in that speech and in many others, sometimes it feels as if what he's actually laying out are his aspirations for what we can be and for a spirit of sacrifice. And then he kind of tacks on he was a fervent anti-communist, don't get me wrong, but he also recognizes that there's a shared story, and with a shared enemy, we can perhaps, bring people together more readily than otherwise. But I think that takes ask not and puts it on. I mean, can you imagine any of those things said today? Don't worry about your pocketbook. It's all about national pride,
Well, I think it's a very, very interesting point. And one of the things that I've come to in my study of Kennedy's foreign policy, which I think jibes with this, is that we in a sense overinterpret a few lines in the inaugural address. Pay any price, bear any burden, oppose any foe. And if you read the rest of the address, and if you read his speech, which is also featured, by the way, in the book, his speech in Seattle in, I think, November of '61, you see somebody who, even in a very dark time in the Cold War, speaks of the need to negotiate, for example, not just with allies, but with adversaries. A sense that we do live on this shared planet in a kind of realistic sense, as he says in that Seattle speech. We're 6% of the world's population. We can't tell the other 94% what to do. There isn't an American solution to every world problem. And this you see from an early point in this administration. There's a quote, if I may, in your essay, Samantha, which I think is powerful. And if you want to respond to it, you can. Or I want to pose a question to Ron. But you say, yet what rings true today from Kennedy's speech, this is at Berkeley in '62, I believe, yes. What rings true today from Kennedy's speech and the broader foreign policy doctrine he sets out is arguably its most simple premise, that regardless of where people come from, human beings across the world yearn for and are entitled to the same rights and freedoms. And I think, again, if you buy the book, as I hope you will, if you haven't already, and if you read that speech and then Samantha's essay, it's really powerful.
Well, I think the resounding theme of this book, which I really urge you all to get, both because it's a collector's item and because it has all these amazing speeches in it, many of which I actually did not know and feel like I should have known now having read them. But I think the theme of idealism without illusions is the one that you all picked up on in your introductory essays. And that's his approach to foreign policy, right? It's, yes, just as that quote suggests, there's a universal aspiration for freedom, a universal aspiration for dignity. We can programmatically aspire to deliver on that through the Alliance for Progress, the Peace Corps, massive infusions of development assistance and investment in diplomacy. But we also have to recognize that there are threats, very real threats out there. And, in many of his speeches that aspire toward what he calls a pragmatic peace, he talks about the need to seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. So it's defense and diplomacy. It's never negotiate in fear, but never fear to negotiate. And my favorite Kennedy line of all time is, he basically says, we can't expect, in the cause of peace, and he's, lived a war. That's a major difference, right, with a lot of our current political leaders. He's lived a war. He knows the cost of war. He knows the importance of peace. But we don't have to invest in the idea that we're just going to all of a sudden love our neighbor, he says. He says what we're looking for is not a revolution in human nature, but an evolution in human institutions. Not revolution, but evolution, and not human nature, which he recognizes will never change. So again, no illusions. And then institutions like the UN, he saw the flaws. He saw the way countries comprised these institutions and pursued their self-interest, but there was no workaround. You still had to forge global cooperation because we were so linked and interdependent.
Yeah. Ron, I'm curious to know what you think about what you've heard so far. You can respond to that, but I also, in your essay, there's something that grabs me a lot, which is you say that there's an iconic question that Kennedy poses. And you say it's ancient and will live long after us. And it's this: what obligations do we have to one another in society and the wider world in a world of such deep interconnections? I wonder if you want to say a word about this as you think about this with respect to JFK, and maybe to what extent JFK himself, with his policy decisions, answered that question.
Yeah. Well, you know, I have to say that I, like Samantha, had not read many of these speeches. I mean, we all read Kennedy's speeches. They're part of the common currency. But so many of them I hadn't read or certainly meditated over. And there's some of them that I read and I find myself, my eyes welled up. It was quite a thing to be reading these during this moment. This is an odd confluence, and maybe one of serendipity that will be of value, that we are celebrating, really, Kennedy's 100th at this moment, when so many of the things that Kennedy speaks of, you know, have been torn asunder. When we ask ourselves, I think, at this moment, a variety of fundamental questions, it's sort of a calling of the question of government that I think a lot of people feel right now, in fact. What is government's role? What can we do in concert with one another? Is there a way we can find, you might call it a shared national narrative, I suppose? You know, I teach a class at Harvard Law School called Public Narrative and Justice. It's all this. And it's to meditate on the leaps forward in social justice and how they were really born of narratives that were shaped, that then became a housing, a vessel really, for people to jump aboard, and there were outcomes. And it's so fascinating now to read some of the speeches and see, in a way, how pragmatic Kennedy is. You know, he talks about institutions. He talks about how government is successful. Powerfully. He says, look, this is the job of government. And it's of course housed in this great confidence in the notion of public. That's in every word, not one of doubt, not one of, you know, everything government does is wrong, busted, inefficient, and don't expect anything. And what's so interesting is, I know that, Samantha, I don't know if you were probably in this meeting, but we talk about Obama bringing a great burst of inspiration in Grant Park and in some of those speeches that I think people can cite lines from now. And there was a meeting in August of the first year, that retreat you all did, where people settled in Obama's first year when he had all that political capital, of course. And they said, what is our goal here? And Obama, I think Favreau and a couple others were riffing. You were, I'm sure, in there, a lot of smart people. And Obama said, I think our goal is to show and prove to the American people that government can be a force of good in their life. Cut right to it, I think. And I think that is at the core of this discussion now. Kennedy is not questioning that. His confidence, and so much of Kennedy is about confidence. You know, he's a World War II guy, and that generation at its first moment grabs power with Kennedy. And what's fascinating to think about is that you cannot really separate Kennedy from his death. And you just can't.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you think of Kennedy as an old man now, going through the process of what people do after they retire and, you know, saying this or that, you know. Well, it's the same in a way for King and Bobby. Yeah. You know, Kennedy is frozen in time. But in some ways, it allows for a kind of powerful preservation of his essence that echoes continually through our generation. There'll become a time when everyone, I mean, it's probably around my age, I'm 57, when everyone who recalls from living memory Kennedy will be gone. There'll be a little pop, almost inaudible, just like it was for Lincoln. And that'll be a time that up ahead in which maybe these questions will not be asked, but now they're being asked. And the question is, how does that sense, that tenor of confidence get restored? And is it possible, after all we've been through since, especially, and I'll just finish with this, at times of crisis. Because I think something that President Obama said often, I think people know this, intuit it, if not say it, is that the only time that we get something shared, a moment in this era where government can at least rise to attempt effectiveness, is in crisis. And we bound from crisis to crisis and hoping that at the moment of crisis there will be a leader sufficient to summon some of these things that we know from our history are us at our best. So.
Thank you. You know, it's this echo that Ron speaks of. It's striking to me that we don't hear it just in this country. I'm from Sweden, and this little Nordic country was in deep despair at the news of the assassination in Dallas in November of 1963. And before that, many of the things that we've discussed before this evening resonated deeply with Swedes. And I think it's fair to say that Swedes who, at least up to now, have a greater faith in the capacity of government, not to solve all problems, but to be a force for good, as we're saying in society, resonates with Swedes in part because of a little book that was translated into Swedish called Studier I Mod, that's Profiles in Courage, and what Kennedy represented also as a politician. And I don't think it has to do just with the fact that he was gunned down at the prime of life. There is something about also the ideas that we're discussing this evening. And, you know, I've got to admit something. I want to go pretty soon here to questions from all of you, but even as somebody who's working on this biography, the speeches collected in this book, many of them are new to me. I'm embarrassed to say, I probably shouldn't say with the camera rolling, but it was striking to me to read, and then the essays that accompany the speeches, to read not just obviously the inaugural, the American University speech, the Civil Rights speech, and so forth, but so many of these. And I guess a question for Doug or Stephen, or both of you. Tell us a little bit about a speech in this book that we need to be familiar with.
So I'd actually like to read something from a speech called Definition of a Liberal, because I think it speaks to what Ron was talking about.
Where was it, and what's the date?
This was given in 1960 as part of the presidential campaign in New York City. And of course, President Kennedy was not always beloved by the liberals in his party because he was extremely pragmatic and non-ideologically appointed Douglas Dillon, who was a Republican, as his Treasury Secretary. Also, Henry Cabot Lodge was a Republican. And he was quite centrist in a lot of his positions. But he said, liberalism is not so much a party creed or a set of fixed platform promises as it is an attitude of mind and heart, a faith in man's ability through the experience of his reason and judgment to increase for himself and his fellow men the amount of justice and freedom and brotherhood which all human life deserves. So who can really argue with that? And, you know, as I was sitting here listening to these brilliant folks, you know, one of the things that President Kennedy said was that art is the great democrat, calling forth the energies of every sector of society without regard to race or creed, wealth or color. So of course we're currently thinking of cutting funding for the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. President Kennedy said that the sick should never be alien to our affections or outside the reach of our communities. Once again, he conceived of Medicare and Medicaid, which were opposed by the Republican Party at the time they were proposed. So we're still fighting that battle today. Under President Kennedy, the highest level of funding for science ever as a nation. We are proposing cuts to our science budget. So I think that his vision of America as this broad society that liberated the energies of the individuals to contribute to each other's lives is something that we do have the capability to get back to today. And I'll just read one final thing, and this is from the last speech that he never got to give in Dallas, the Dallas Trademark speech. In a world of complex and continuing problems, in a world full of frustrations and irritations, America's leadership must be guided by the lights of learning and reason, or else those who confuse rhetoric with reality and the plausible with the possible will gain popular ascendancy with their seemingly swift and simple solutions to every world problem. There will always be voices expressing opposition without alternative, finding fault but never favor, perceiving gloom on every side, and seeking influence without responsibility. We cannot expect that everyone, to use the phrase of a decade ago, will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to this nonsense. And he believed that the wisdom of the great American consensus will always prevail. He said that in another speech called Voices of Extremism. So I do think the question that he posed, can a nation such as ours long endure, is still with us. And if you watch Fareed Zakaria today, I think he's feeling very much that our democracy is at stake, even now as it was in 1960, when we faced an external threat.
So,
Doug,
let me add just briefly to that. Look, I once got to interview Gerald Ford out in Rancho Mirage, and he was on the Warren Commission for killing Kennedy. And after we had a lunch at his little club, he brought me in his office and he said, "I want you to see this." And it was a big stack of papers like that. I said, "Yeah." And he goes, and he's now, "Look over here, little tiny file." And he said, "You know the difference between those?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "That's the mail I got this week asking me about who killed Kennedy. That's the mail about who cares about my presidency." The point being, the death of John F. Kennedy is such a large topic. And I teach at Rice University, all students want to know what happened, who did it, are there missing pieces, are there more documents? Because the visuals were so intense. I mean, America had fallen in love with John F. Kennedy. He was our first movie star, handsome television president. He came of age right when covering special event TV like Scott Carpenter going into space or John Glenn going was must-watch TV, and they'd come then and meet the president. And then he invented the modern news conference with press pool that Donald Trump is now threatening to abolish, where the president could stand up there and you handle questions. He turned it into a marvelous free-for-all of Q&A and also laughter. And people learned he could be self-deprecating, and we learned what a great wit he had. He was extraordinarily photographic, and some of the best, Stephen and I say some of the great photographers of the 20th century used to be obsessive about following Kennedy and got these extraordinary photos. So when he died, we felt we knew him. But we didn't know him as the way you might know old FDR on the radio during the Great Depression. We knew him as the future. He represented us for the future of a new generation of democracy, and now it got snuffed out. And since then, there's a whole lot of Americans who feel something went wrong in our country. Once Kennedy was shot, Johnson came in, Vietnam War, riots in the streets, the Nixon's lies in Cambodia and Laos. And so in some ways, it's been interesting. His 100th birthday, it seems to me to be, I used to always think of it as the beginning of the 60s, the beginning of modernity. But in some ways, it's also the last chapter of a generation of public servants that went from way back, but certainly was there with the Roosevelt and Eisenhower, Truman administrations. And then after him, something else has kicked in. The journalists of the Kennedy years, Kennedy's extracurricular activities, weren't getting reported in the newspapers. But by the late 60s, presidents would everybody now looks for you to slip, fall, weird pictures. I mean, the whole Watergate phenomena of Woodward and Bernstein. That we've lost the sense of the kind of relationship between press and presidents. He could have in on key meetings, going to the moon. He called in Hugh Seide of Time Magazine to sit in on the big meeting on whether we should go to the moon or not. And reporters were actually working in tandem with the White House to try to come up with American policy ideas. Cut to this morning on the news shows, it's all about the hatred between the enemy media and Donald Trump. And it's hard to feel that we haven't had a corrosion that's been happening since the 1960s in our civic engagement with politics. I'll end by saying, look, 1960 was really close between Nixon and Kennedy, but we didn't ride it in the street. We didn't start a big game of spitting at each other. Kennedy, as Stephen said, brought in Republicans like Mac Bundy and Lodge and Dillon and others, try to be a little more bipartisan, found a big bipartisan issue in the space race to work together as one, try to find ways to heal us and bring us together. And he's the last president that was able really to do that kind of healing. And it's one reason I think people miss him. There's a nostalgia for John F. Kennedy, and as Ron said, we're all getting older. We're all getting balding or gray hair. I've got arthritis right now and all this, but the Kennedy staying handsome and young. We have no visual images of him later in life, so there's always going to be something day glow about him. And I notice young people, when they have, I teach history of the presidency, about 3/4 of the students want to do papers on Kennedy. His life and lore still matters to them.
I want to finish this portion of the event by posing a question to Ron and to Samantha and see if they want to answer it. But while I do, or before I do, if you have a question, because we do want to hear your views on this, I think the plan is for you to line up right here behind this microphone. So as you make your way, I want to pose a question. Let me also say, of course, apropos the assassination, that President Trump is going to be making a decision about whether to release thousands of pages of documents pertaining to the assassination.
Oh, boy.
My guess is he'll do so. My guess also, and I could be wrong, is that they won't reveal maybe quite as much as some people think they will reveal about the intelligence surrounding the assassination and who committed the murder. But that's something else we can look forward to President Trump doing. My question for the two of you, or one of you, or both, is how we should define presidential greatness, and whether you think John F. Kennedy fits that bill.
I went last. Why don't you go first on this one?
I went first last time.
Okay,
dude.
all right, I'll go first.
I'm happy to. So I mean, I actually was struck. Part of what I understand from government from 8 years is just how long it takes to get anything done, and to get big things done. I mean, healthcare, which people say, oh, we got healthcare in the first term, but you remember what it took to get healthcare done. Even the stimulus, right, when our economy was tanking, passed by, what was it, 1 vote or something. I mean, and Iran, Cuba, the Paris Agreement, the things that we take pride in and are very worried are all going to be dismantled. It's not like we weren't trying to get things done in the first 4 years. It's just to build those relationships, to have the back channels, and then for those to bear fruit. And so I was extremely struck. There are dimensions of Kennedy's legacy that I was not aware of until I read this book. I was not aware that even though I guess in the end he wasn't the person who created the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Endowment for Humanities, he launched the process that then produced their creation right at the beginning, I guess, of Johnson's time. The Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress. I was struck, there's a fact in the book that Kennedy mentioned Africa 479 times in the 1960 election. What? I mean, so whole parts of the world, the amassing of soft power, of political capital for the United States by speaking out against colonialism, imperialism, little pockets of hypocrisy, put that to one side. People believed him. And they believed, and he was pretty explicit even about addressing those pockets of hypocrisy by and large. Like, turns out we're going to have to partner with non-freedom loving nations in pursuit of the cause of expanding freedom and so forth. So I actually think the legacy, notwithstanding the very short period of time, was substantial, but like everybody, it's just very painful to go back over all of the agendas that he set forth and to know that this was a life and a presidency interrupted. But so many of Johnson's achievements were ones that had been set in motion, of course, by Kennedy.
Okay, I'll jump in and then we'll go to Q&A. We've got some lined up here. So I think we can fairly say, that, and certainly the historians at the table, that civilizations rise or fall on confidence and how they harness a kind of confidence in their perspicacity, their capacity, and their place. And I think the legacy of Kennedy is quite powerful. You know, he had a very short term, but as I said, we can't really separate Kennedy from the tragedy. I mean, I frankly think that, I was a police reporter for a while, is that, you know, most people have never seen someone killed in front of them. I mean, I actually saw that as a reporter once. Except this first moment, the whole nation watched their president slaughtered on television. And I feel like in reporting I've done with folks suffering from PTSD, I find lots of echoes historically over time of folks who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorders. You can map it through history. And I think that what's interesting about Kennedy is you say, okay, I'm not separating the actions from what then follow, many of them because he is struck down. I mean, Johnson is given, the great tactician of Congress, is given just a buffet table of Kennedy said and Kennedy wanted. And in a way, this great leap since Roosevelt, the Great Society, is really because of these things happening together. You know, you couldn't have asked for it to be wrought any more brilliantly. Kennedy goes down and John's like, I can get these things done. And so what's interesting, as you mentioned, Doug, is how many of the things that we embrace do start in either policy papers or in ideas and speeches in this book from Kennedy in this short term in which he's alive and in office. And so I think the legacy now is really this blended legacy of, you know, of a president who, look, it's not just what they do in office, it's what comes of it. You know, history judges. And George Bush says, you know, well, I'll be dead by then, who cares? You know, but we do care, and presidents care. And Kennedy's legacy has been vastly enlarged because of his short term and then what happens. And actual outcomes have emerged from that combination. And under that yardstick, there's no doubt that his effect on America and many outcomes that we can measure are vast. And that is legacy, I think, after all. Yeah. I mean, the last thing I'll just say is that if you want to get a speech that really stunned me reading it, it's the Yale speech he gives in 1962, the Yale commencement speech. First off, it's all Kennedy. He does great shtick on now being a Yale man. He just beats the crap out of the Yale people, you know. And you know what does he say? I have the best thing, a Harvard education and a Yale degree. I mean, right off the bat, he's killing it. But he says a couple brilliant things in the middle that go right to not just who he is at this moment, but certainly in a way who he will become soon in his legacy. Because he talks just brilliantly and even contradicts himself on this notion of myth and reality. I mean, here's a line, I'll just read this. He says, for the enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest. And I'm not sure what Trump would say about that, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. And soon he will become myth. And then later in the speech, he kind of goes back on himself when he talks about confidence, which of course Kennedy wrote a lot about and thought a lot about, society's confidence. He says, you know, finally, I come to the matter of confidence. Confidence is a matter of myth, but also a matter of truth. So he sees it all in one speech, not with the kind of easy one-liner, but with almost a kind of forward casting of thought as to not just what is, but what he will become, and what he will become to us. How real is this myth of Kennedy? What does it speak to us now in this time? And ultimately, that's why it's wonderful to be in a room like this on this 100th anniversary at this moment. So, to questions.
Can I say one thing, Fred?
Yes,
so one of the things that I think is interesting about President Kennedy is how he grows as a person as a result of his experience. And Tennessee Williams said that a high station in life is won by the gallantry by which one survives appalling circumstances with grace. And so he loses, his brother and sister during the war. I watched my Uncle Ted give the nomination speech for Barack Obama with a brain tumor, terminal diagnosis after he had kidney stones removed the night before. And he gave that speech. And so I feel like we're at a moment now in America where we need to go to that place. And we need to summon what it is we can summon from our history and ourselves to meet the challenges of our time. And that's why we did this book.
Richard Reeves, the author, I was on a show with him this week, and he answered this question with it's a mixed answer. He's not quite prepared, I think, to call JFK a great president, and he's critical of some aspects of Kennedy's policies. But I like his simple formulation that Reeves offered, which is, John F. Kennedy made the country a better place. And that's something that I reflected on after that show. Let's do this. Since we don't have a great deal of time, I would ask you to keep your questions short. I may actually take a couple of them at a time in the interests of time. Sir, please.
Yes, Carl Gollivan, if I could give a domain reference, jfkvigil.com. And actually, you raised the records issue that are either to come out or not come out this year. And that domain is forwarded to an invitation to all Americans to come to Washington, D.C., noon on May 29th, to peaceably assemble in our constitutional tradition on the terraces of the Kennedy Center in petition for release of the records to give political cover and encouragement.
Thank you for that.
Is there a question?
Yep, thank you.
Yes, a question. I would have read from JFK's speech to journalists concerning secrecy, but what would JFK's own perspective be on this, whether the CIA would still try to withhold records after even one of their own, E. Howard Hunt, confessed to involvement in the assassination? So what would JFK think of secrecy? Had he lived, would the agency have been allowed to have kept records secret?
Thank you for that question. Sir, next question, please.
Yes, I'm wondering, Kennedy started out as very Massachusetts-centric and then lived in D.C., how running in the election changed his breadth of views around the differences, the strong regional differences across the country. In looking at historical record, we see his views on what needs to be done changed by traveling across the country in the electoral process?
Yeah, I think that it's that you mean when he was campaigning in 1960 and before? Oh, he had a private plane and he got to travel all over America. But he was a great listener, and he was able to talk to coal miners and farmers and connect with them. He wasn't somebody who was aloof from the campaigning process. Anybody who met him liked him, but it wasn't the kind of like that we talk about now as who would you rather have a barbecue with, who would you rather drink a beer with. He seemed to try to uplift people. I mean, even in rural America, he would give speeches quoting from historical precedents. He didn't dumb down his speech for an audience, so to speak. He stayed polished and self-assured, but on loose moments, he would be able to flash that smile and crack a joke and make people feel very comfortable. So when you really study the West Virginia primary and see how John Kennedy, he didn't put on workers' clothes to go in the mine with them, nor did he do like Trump did recently, fake shoveling. But he did go and hang with them and talk to them and sit at their workstation with them and try to understand what was their biggest concerns. And that outreach convinced people that he was young and aggressive and he cared about them. And I think he ran much more better retail politics in '60 than, say, Hubert Humphrey did or Lyndon Johnson did or Stuart Symington did, the other potential Democratic nominees. In addition, he took the smartest position papers from a group called the DAC, Democratic Advisory Council, which would create papers like Rachel Carson would write on ecology, Dean Acheson on the State Department, John Kenneth Galbraith on the economy, and these were almost New Yorker-like white papers that they would feed Kennedy, and he would absorb some of the ideas. So this group that grew around John F. Kennedy really truly were great intellectuals. I write about conservation a lot, as you can tell. I've mentioned my love of public lands, but they brought in Stuart Udall, brought in people like Wallace Stegner, one of the great novelists ever, and Peter Matheson, who had traveled the Himalayas and all over the world, and they would consult with William O. Douglas on water and land issues. And so there was an intellectual fervor going on around Kennedy's campaign and after he got elected, which is typified by Robert Frost reading his poem at the inaugural, but people don't realize weeks later they had a special evening for Carl Sandburg in the White House. And that celebration wasn't just for the arts, but it was for intellectuals, book people, poets, philosophers. They had a place in Kennedy's Washington, and that's what made that era so special. I was with Madeleine Albright at the Washington Speaker's Correspondent, and she told me in all of her long life, there's only one frozen time when Washington was glowing, and it was so special, and that was when Kennedy was in the White House. Just something about living in D.C. with all that hope and promise in young people.
Let's go with 2 more questions here quickly, please.
One of the recurring themes we've heard from all the panelists today is that where we are now as a nation, we are to paraphrase a very different piece of presidential rhetoric, we're having a crisis of confidence in our national institutions, the likes of which we have not seen in many, many decades in this country. And I was wondering if any of you, but especially you, Ambassador Power, because of your experience in the United Nations, could speak on how that development has paralleled with the public perception of our confidence in our international institutions, of the sense of global community, and how that's evolved as so many Americans find their faith rattled in their own national civic systems. Thank you.
Samantha, if you could hold that for a second. Yes, please, sir.
First, thank you for a very inspirational panel. In thinking back on Kennedy, it wasn't so easy for him. He had many problems. Much of what he wanted to get done, he wasn't able to, but I think a common thread that he presented and Mr. Brinkley addressed, he had vision. He was able to accept ideas from people and incorporate them in his thoughts. I wonder how you feel about that, because I see that as a thread in other presidents who seem to have been great and have established a legacy of vision.
Excellent, thank you. Samantha, you want to take the first?
Sure. I thought the earlier question about traveling around the country was really interesting. I don't have any wisdom on that, but I was, again, struck by a line in the book that I had not heard before, which came from Eleanor Roosevelt, who had previously criticized Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, as needing a little less profile, a little more courage. and so something happened on the way to the forum, certainly in the evolution of his liberalism, and I don't know, Stevie might have a view on that as well. The question on the parallel or the mirroring between a loss of confidence in national institutions and international institutions, great question. And what I'd say just a few things and try to be brief given the other questions. First, what international institutions are, or at least what the UN is, as the best example, is the aggregation of 193 largely dysfunctional countries. So, it's not just that, people are sort of spiraling a little bit in losing faith in institutions at home and that therefore they're in a bad mood, and then they're like, well, then the UN, screw the UN too. It's actually that we bring our dysfunction, the United States, if we are in gridlock and can't pass a budget, we're bringing that then to the United Nations, and that's relevant to the UN budget discussions. That's relevant to whether we're able to provide humanitarian assistance or send peacekeepers. So that's point one. Point two is in the essay that I did, which was on a speech that Kennedy gave about what he called a revolution in national independence. He saw the number of countries in the world doubling since the Second World War, since the creation of the UN in San Francisco. There were 51 countries. In Kennedy's time, there were 106. So he suddenly saw these countries cropping up, and he had a great sense of optimism, I think, about where things were going, because as countries sought their independence, as colonialism ended, as imperialism was waning, he thought this will allow the flourishing of people's aspirations, their ability to achieve their freedom and achieve their destinies. What he didn't anticipate was that a bunch of thugs and goons would take over a lot of these countries and mistreat their people and indeed quash their aspirations for freedom. So it wasn't only colonial powers that would deny those aspirations, it was sovereign governments. And indeed the idea of sovereignty, which Kennedy thought was a great a positive development, that countries would crop up and get to live within their national borders and represent the people who live within those countries, became a shield for external scrutiny. I mention that because today one of the other reasons that people have lost faith in international institutions is, if you can believe it, in 2017 there are more than half the countries within the UN are not democratic. So notwithstanding, the expansion of democracy and freedom, relatively speaking, and especially, great advances in alleviating poverty, the actual governance structures are going very much in the wrong direction. And every year over the last decade, you've seen a drop, modest drop, but nonetheless, the trend lines are going in the wrong direction. So that also contributes to the dysfunction.
Does anybody want to take the last question? Ron, do you have a...
You're our last question. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I like your vision. I wanted to get your parlance because the notion of vision is at the core of this. I think when we get to legacy, right now people are crying out for a vision. That's something that is actually mentioned in the Berkeley speech that Samantha did a great essay on, of the age of independence, countries finding their independence, but also he calls it the age of interdependence. Globally, it's globalism. The word had not yet been invented. And you feel the tension right now all over the world with the pushback of nationalism against the wave of globalism. And what's interesting now is this question of vision. People are yearning for it, and I think that we've all talked about this in terms of leadership, is that the great leaders that you kind of infer, are able to paint a picture of the future so vivid, seemingly so real, that they can almost guide people to step within it and say, and let me ask you, what will that country look like? And how will you feel on that day, which is really the key. And that's the notion of leadership as to vision that Kennedy clearly was brilliant at. I mean, no one disputes that. Obviously, he wasn't alive to have the outcomes visible to him, but I think that's the echo of Kennedy now. Who can speak to vision in that way?
We, I think, are about out of time, but this gentleman has been very patient. Do we have time for one more? Okay, so one last question. Yes, sir.
To extend your trope of PTSD, one survivor symptom is a desire for romanticization, celebration, hagiography. And I wanted to hear you digest and unpack. You've used kind of the euphemisms that we use, pragmatism, hypocrisy, but what about the, dismaying record on civil rights, the dirty tricks of the Kennedy political machine, the womanizing, the Cold War follies like the Bay of Pigs and Vietnam? One could look at these different issues and say, oh, he started these things, but one could also say, oh, he couldn't quite get it done like LBJ, right? Yeah. So I wonder if you could mull over those dark sides that we struggle with how to digest.
Well, I'll just say briefly that the dark side is all so powerfully and visibly known to the world at this point, because we do tear down our leaders. They suffer from Icarus and Scheherazade syndromes, and we've torn that part of Kennedy, the myth, I think, in part, is matched now by all the profound flaws. I mean, what I find when I've reported on all the current presidents, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, is that, many of them are mixtures of flaws and strengths. In fact, it's often the flaws that create the the stuff that grows into the compensatory strengths that we admire. And I think we find that with Kennedy, which is why we can't take our eyes off the Kennedy story. I mean, you know, Shakespeare couldn't have done any better than that, than this one. And I think as to PTSD, look, I think you're hearing echoes, and I like the idea of part of PTSD is that hagiography effect. That's one I've noticed too. So a smart question.
Well, let me just unpack, as you said, a couple of the things you mentioned. Bay of Pigs, disaster. Kennedy, though, handled that after he did it, took blame for it, even though it was an Eisenhower leftover CIA plan, kind of did the buck stops here thing, shot up in the polls to about 80%. By the time he left in his first 100 days with the Bay of Pigs in it, he had a 73 or 4% public approval rating. So here he did something, didn't work, but by owning it, he kind of grew in stature. With Vietnam, there's a lot of evidence. His last interview with Walter Cronkite before his death, where he was talking about we're not going to get suckered into another Korean War situation. We're not going to get suckered in. Now, that gets debated fiercely. Ken Burns' documentary is going to be showing both sides of that. But there's some feeling that if Vietnam came up, Kennedy was in the 64 presidential campaign, was not going to be cheerleading that we've got to send troops in the way that Johnson did once Gulf of Tonkin hit, and then by 65 he did. That has to be left as kind of a what if, but there's some very good evidence that he may not have gotten us into that. Yeah. The womanizing is very real. It would have to be seen as almost sexual compulsion of some kind. Some people think because he was on cortisone shots, he had a Dr. Feelgood giving him injections due to his Addison's disease and trying to get his adrenaline up, that he had an increased libido. How long that whole act could have continued certainly wouldn't have lasted today, not in the way the media looks. People used to whisper about Kennedy and women, but today it would have been just all over and blown up around him. There was a machoism about John F. Kennedy. That's why I liked this mystique and machoism. He was all a PT 109 skipper who then, you know, I love Alan Shepard and John Glenn and the astronauts and these brave men that are going out there, and he talked about exploration and even we're going to go to the moon. And when he went to the moon, he talked about why Mallory climbs, you know, the highest mountains in the world because they're there and we conquer them. And so there was a kind of heavy male kind of energy sort of coming out of Kennedy, which I think was partially generational, but maybe grew out of his father's view of what constituted an active male figure. But I can see that in modern times for people in gender studies and things, it's confusing, sometimes disappointing behavior of John Kennedy. Conversely, Theodore Roosevelt wanted women, here at Harvard, he did his thesis that women should never have to lose their name, that you should keep their last name forever when they get married, was an early feminist, early suffragist, and when he'd be married, he was a devoted husband, no affairs, credible, you know, father, even though he was also a macho, you know, kind of guy. So all these presidents in the role of sex has to be looked at and understood when you do biography. Kennedy's gotten a lot of that written about him. And so I think here on the centennial, we're talking about it left because it has a bit of a tabloid feel to it, but also seems, as Ron was suggesting, it's seeming to be a little old hat at this moment in time.
I want to give Samantha and Ron the last word, but let me just say on Vietnam that it seems to me a paradox, and I've struggled with this in my own writing for many, many years. There's a paradox in Kennedy. I'm convinced that from an early point, even in the French War, he was convinced that no Western power could win a straight military victory over Ho Chi Minh's revolution. I don't think that doubt ever went away, and yet, in his 1,000 days as president, he expands American involvement significantly. And in the Ken Burns documentary, there's a companion volume in which I have an essay, and I grapple with this and also with the what if. Suppose he returns from Dallas alive, what happens? But I think the subtext of this question is correct, that there is in many cases this paradox with Kennedy that we have to grapple with. Samantha, and then Ron gets the last.
I also just wanted to, I think the question is excellent, and I just start in responding to it by saying guilty as charged. I think this was a hagiographic panel, and I think partly that's for some of the reasons that have been discussed. Partly it's because everyone's really depressed, and we're really enjoying going back in time. So that's point one. But I also think that there is more substance to Kennedy's legacy than actually, notwithstanding the fact that 3/4 of the students want to write their papers on Kennedy, I don't think there's a very rich common understanding of his programmatic impact. So I think it's actually fair to have a little bit of an antidote to the good looks and even the speeches, all of which you can talk about, but to touch upon the programs. I just want to close making one point, particularly because you mentioned the Bay of Pigs. A terrifying what-if question from back in the day would be, what if the Cuban Missile Crisis had happened in April 1961? In other words, and I think some of the Vietnam, the excellent questions that have been posed about would he, wouldn't he, and will continue to be posed forevermore, but again, having lived some of these discussions in the Situation Room, I can see what happened in April 61. There have been brilliant books, as you know, written, The Essence of Decision, about the Cuban Missile Crisis, sort of the opposite of the Bay of Pigs, where it really took a new president, would have taken a new president a lot. He should have had it, obviously, and he was the first to say that, but to stand up in front of the herd, to say, no, I know better, notwithstanding having just come and having been a senator. So that thought experiment of, gosh, thank God Cuban Missile Crisis was in October 62 and not in April 61, but it's a thought experiment that isn't a lot of fun to do today. Because when you imagine the crisis, particularly in the early months, and again, particularly when there's not a lot of seasoned expertise, on the backbenches as well as around the table. There is a lot, of course, in terms of General Mattis and McMaster, but I think the question of how a president makes decisions, having never made those decisions before, is one that is we are all acutely aware of the momentousness of that phenomenon these days.
So quickly, I'm just going to follow up on Bay of Pigs because I think our historians may agree is that the presidents we tend to like historically are the ones who manage to evolve in the utterly unreasonable ionized air of that Oval Office, and not the ones who dig in and become brittle. And there's no doubt, as Samantha says brilliantly here, Bay of Pigs, is that Kennedy does evolve. And in fact, this might be fresh information. I mean, you might know this, Stephen, but I was interviewing Teddy in 2004 for a Times piece I was doing, and it was when George W. Bush wouldn't admit to some of the errors on WMD. And Teddy was telling a story, and he's like, my father came to visit Jack after Bay of Pigs, and Bobby and I were there, and he says, and he says to Jack, and Jack was deeply dispirited. He says, Jack, just say you screwed up. And Jack said, geez, Dad, I can't, you can't, no, I can't do that, no. And my father said, no, Jack, it's what you've got to do. I mean, it's not an in spite of, it's a because of here. Yeah. You did. And that's what leadership is going to be about if you step up. And Teddy says, my father often gave us a lot of advice that was not very good. But that was very, very good. And of course, you see Kennedy evolving in this unreasonable place called the Oval Office. And if there's any lesson that that might be a yield for a new president, obviously could not be more different. It's this notion of saying, I'm wrong. I'm new to this. There's only so much I can know. And I've made mistakes, and maybe grievous ones. That might be just a little nugget of something from then that might have relevance for now.
Well,
can I say one?
Oh, please, yes, Stephen, of course.
So
Stephen put this whole book together.
No.
This is his book. He did a remarkable job on it. I just want you to know.
So I think it was Winston Churchill who said, "No man is a hero to his valet." And so I grew up in the Kennedy family. I'm not jejune about the faults that my uncles had. But what I think that I wanted to focus on, or we wanted to focus on, is what's useful right now. And in particular, as you look at this body of work, and I think Robert Dallek said that President Kennedy was the second greatest orator of the 20th century, next to Churchill, who was his hero. You know, this use of language to kind of connect people, and also this very real thing that is not an imaginary thing, this notion of American civic identity, the things that we actually do have in common, because right now what we have is a tribalism on the right, of an anti-immigrant tribalism, and a tribalism on the left of social category as identity. And what we really have in common is this civic identity and these institutions and this history. And so sharing that history is our way of kind to, you know, connect us to that common experience that we have of civic identity. And so I hope that we've been able to convey some of that tonight.
There's so much more to be said about all this. And of course, for me, as somebody who's working on a biography, this has been an enormously illuminating evening. The book, as I suggested earlier, is for me immensely useful. I want to encourage you as we part company to come up. The book is available for purchase. I want to thank you for coming out on Mother's Day, and once again, happy Mother's Day to those of you in that category. And please join me in thanking our